What's up, y'all? So, in case you didn't know, like if you know absolutely nothing about me, I'm a Maoist. So, what the fuck is a Maoist? Because a lot of people are confused about what Maoism is. They think that, oh, BRG thinks that everything Mao did was based. No, I acknowledge that Mao did some very stupid things. For example, deciding that Yankee imperialism was a better ally than Soviet social imperialism, which led to all types of opportunism and nasty things in practice, such as fucking over several revolutions in Africa and not backing the Vietnamese as hard as she could. Like he ended up recognizing Pinochet, uh, Marcos. As a matter of fact, there's a picture of one of the Gang of Four, Zhongqing, with Ferdinand and Bong Bong Marcos. Bong Bong is currently the president of the American colony of the Philippines. So, yeah. Thoughts on the new People's Army in the Philippines? I think they're based, of course. I mean, they were one of the very first parties and people's armies that operated under the principles of what we can currently call Maoism. So I love the NPA. Revolution Mabuhay, I believe the correct saying is. I don't speak Tagalog, so what is Maoism? Maoism is an extension and development of Marxism-Leninism applicable to the present era. It was developed by Mao during the course of the Chinese Revolution in the process of socialist construction in the fight against modern revisionism, and particularly during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Were there errors during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution? Yes. There's errors during anything that is taking place for the very first time. But as a Maoist, I acknowledge that the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was the closest that human society has advanced towards communism today. Maoism's contributions include the theory of contradictions, the development of the theory of knowledge, and the formulation of the mass line, which can be defined as from the masses to the masses. I've actually seen quite a few people in DSA that are interested in like learning what the mass line is. And I think that it's really applicable to growing and developing DSA along with sharpening our political line. So I'm really glad that a lot of DSA people are acknowledging the universality of the mass line. What else is Maoism giving us? This theory of new democracy, the formulation of the path of revolution for colonies and semi-colonies, and the formulation regarding the three instruments of the revolution: the party, the People's Army, and the United Front. The theory of protracted people's war and the development of the principles of military warfare, the development of the organizational principles of the proletarian party through the understanding of two-line struggle, rectification campaigns, and criticism and self-criticism, the development of the political economy of socialism on the basis of the Soviet and Chinese experience, and a dialectical understanding of the process of socialist construction, as the correct handling of contradictions in the process of transition to socialism, and finally, and most importantly, the theory and practice of continuing revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat to consolidate socialism, combat modern revisionism, and prevent the restoration of capitalism and its concrete expression in the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. So this is from the Marxism-Leninism Maoism basic course. It's right there in the header. It was developed by one of the parties that would go on to form the CPI Maoist in 2004, I believe. So why is acknowledging the possibility of transitioning back from socialism to capitalism important? Because a lot of people are still unclear on this point. A lot of people think that once you declare socialism, once you have a communist party in power, then it's all good. But as we know, the theory of contradiction teaches us that a good thing can turn into a bad thing and vice versa. So it's important to keep in mind that once you have socialism, and socialism is not just the state owning everything, okay? Like, it's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more complicated than that. Like, the seeds of a new ruling class, of a new bourgeoisie, can arise out of state-owned enterprises. Because socialism is an imperfect thing. It's a transitional stage. It's not a permanent stage. Okay, shit, communism isn't even a permanent stage. Like, communism is going to develop into something else. What that something else is, we don't know, because we haven't achieved communism yet. So we have to be careful when we call ourselves socialists and when we call ourselves communists, because we have to acknowledge that, like, shit can go bad really fast. Example, China. Example, Cuba, which is kind of struggling right now. So it's important that you recognize the importance of mobilizing the people and struggling against these bad elements within the socialist project as they appear. My thoughts on piracy. Well, you mean like ocean piracy or you mean like digital piracy? I kind of support both. Do you think that Maoism is still a reasonable way to overthrow the bourgeoisie in West Africa? Yeah. Like West Africa is pretty prone to military coups. And honestly, I prefer a progressive coup government um, as opposed to a puppet state of French imperialism. But the thing with military coups is that they're inherently unstable, as Thomas Sankara proved. Like he took over the country through a coup, through an officer's coup, a junior officer's coup, and shit was going pretty good for a while. But eventually, one of his own comrades assassinated him and drove the country into an even worse predicament than it was in the first place. So, um, military coups, I'm not a fan of because they do not rely on the masses; they rely on the strength of a handful of people. And the thing is, like once that handful of people start fighting, you're gonna have a problem. And when problems like that happen, as we saw in Grenada, Yankee, French, British imperialism going to come in to restore order, and by restore order, I mean restore the old system. So you have to rely on the people. You have to mobilize the people. You have to have an armed sea of people, an armed sea of the masses. I think the Partido Comunista de Peru called it, to secure socialism, and protect the socialist system, the socialist project from meddling and outright destruction of the newborn project at the hands of internal compradors, aka sellouts, and foreign imperialist governments. So yes, I do think that the lessons of Maoism are or something that need to be embraced by communist formations in Africa. Like I would say that the vanguard of the communist formations in Africa currently are in Swaziland, well, Eswatini, and in Kenya, where revolutionaries have been waging an all-out struggle against the sellout Ruto and his IMF bullshit. So, all power to the people of Africa. We will all be free. Thoughts on Enver Hoxha's anti-revisionism? I think that he had some good points. I really like his work criticizing Euro communism and social democracy, but I also think that he was a bit of an opportunist in that he rode Mao's dick as long as Mao was alive, and then after Mao died, he was like, "Oh, see, I knew this guy was a revisionist all along." So, I'm not a Hoxhite because every Hoxhite that I've met has been terminally online and weird, and they also have a very, very nasty socialist, nasty social conservative strain shot through their ideology. Like Hoxha thought that jazz was jungle music, and he did a whole bunch of weird shit. I think he banned makeup. He banned foreign music, like a bunch of weird, crazy shit. So, not really a fan on how he ran his country, but in terms of like socialism and adherence to Stalin, like I have several critiques of Stalin, and Verhofstadt did not have several critiques of Stalin. He and Stalin were besties, and he was also mortally afraid of Tito. And the more I learn about Tito, like I used to have like a pretty hard line of view, like Tito was a piece of shit. But like the more I talk to people who actually grew up in Yugoslavia, like St. Louis has the largest population of Bosnians anywhere outside of Bosnia. And when you talk to the older generation who actually grew up under Marshal Tito, they're actually very, very nostalgic for the way that that the country was run. As a Maoist, of course, I have critiques. Like it was basically a market socialist economy, very close to the West, but also it had a very high standard of living, and a lot of people like living there. So who am I to tell a Bosnian person that grew up in Yugoslavia under Tito that they're all wrong? Like, I'm not like that. What do I think were the reasons for victory of the Deng Xiaoping Ru Chaoqi line during the Cultural Revolution? Well, for one, after Mao died, there was a sort of Praetorian coup where the Gang of Four were summoned to a meeting and they were all arrested. And they were initially sentenced to death, but these sentences were commuted to prison sentences. So you have that. And then the fact that the Gang of Four was generally like really, really bad at organizing and getting their line out to the masses. For example, there was a massive earthquake right before Mao died in 1976. The Gang of Four initiated a campaign called Denounce Deng Xiaoping on the ruins. Meantime, Deng Xiaoping was organizing relief efforts. So if you're a peasant in Maoist China, like, who are you going to back? The guys who are trying to get you to wage political propaganda while you're trying to dig your family out from under several tons of rubble, or the guy who's bringing in bulldozers and other necessary equipment to help remove your family from the rubble? So, yeah. Is it true that President Gonzalo boiled children? No. There was a horrible method of using scalding hot water as an execution method, but I have never seen any credible account of the Communist Party of Peru engaging in the boiling of children. That impresses me as an Orientalist and outright racist myth. I mean, this was the Andean Mountains, so yeah, shit did get kind of funky up there, and a lot of people died who probably shouldn't have died. But boiling children, come on, like, that's weird. Do the Indian Maoists have a realistic chance of taking power in this half a century? Well, the thing is, protracted people's war. Protracted means long. They've been fighting since 1967. So, honestly, yeah. I'm a revolutionary optimist. It would be kind of senseless for me to be a Maoist and be like, oh no, the Indians can't take power, because they can. But the major thing is that India is a rapidly urbanizing country. Maoists in the third world, like, it's pretty much a trope that we are based amongst the peasant population, but a lot of the peasant population, they're losing their land to multinational corporations. So a lot of these people are being urbanized. Like, you have huge fucking shacks that are on the peripheries of major Indian cities. Like, if you look at Mumbai, New Delhi, Chennai, all these big cities, Bangalore, all these big cities, like, you've got huge, ultra modern situations. And then right across the road, you've got a huge fucking slum. And it was actually the same way in Peru. Like, you had people that had been driven by the government out of the mountain areas, out of the countryside, into what they called new settlements. Like, you had giant shanty towns around Lima and Callao and all of these big Peruvian cities. And what the PCP did, the PCP was actually, I would think, better at organizing these shanty towns, organizing these slums than the Indians are. But if you read urban perspectives, they're actually struggling theoretically and ideologically with this question. So the eventual success of the Indian Maoist project depends on the success that they have in reaching into urban areas. So yes, I do think that they can take power in this half of a century if they properly take advantage of contradictions within Indian society, which I think that they're actually pretty good at. Scientific Maoist thought on skibbity toilet. Skibbity toilet cannot be explained. I don't know what the fuck skibbity toilet is. What are my thoughts on the PSL? Well, I'm not a PSL member. I'm not in PSL, so that kind of tells you right there. A lot of shiesty shit with them. I have a lot of friends that are in PSL, so I'm not going to delve into that out of respect for them. But yeah, if I were you, I would not join PSL. I'd join DSA. What are my thoughts on Tiananmen Square? I'm glad you asked, because Hakeem actually has a new video out on Tiananmen Square. Let's take a look at it. Hold on, let me share this tab instead. Oh, he's using Frizzo as a source. Oh, dear.
The students keep asking, what should we do next? What can we accomplish? I feel so sad. Because how can I tell them that what we are actually hoping for is bloodshed? For the moment when the government has no choice but to brazenly butcher the people. Only when the square is awash with blood will the people of China open their eyes. Only then will they really be united. But how can I explain any of this to my fellow students? And what is truly sad is that some students and some famous, well-connected people are working hard to help the government, to prevent it from taking such measures.
This is Chai Ling, the self-declared supreme leader of the Tiananmen Square protests. We'll get back to her soon. How about this, then? Tank Man is usually presented to Western audiences as some regular, brave guy standing up to a ruthless, authoritarian regime. What you're not told is that A, these are tanks leaving the square, and the man is standing in their way, and B, that there is video footage of this event, and what is always implied.
It's amazing, like, how the West has this narrative of this brave dude standing in front of the tanks. Like, it's a meme now. Like, every political cartoon that features somebody standing up to bad authoritarians, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a play on a Tank Man meme. Like, this guy is probably still alive. This guy is still alive somewhere in an apartment, chilling out. Like, he didn't get run over. He didn't get shot at. Like, he was basically run out of the square. And like Hakeem said, they're leaving the square. My own personal take on Tiananmen Square is that it's complicated. Yes, there were elements that wanted a color revolution. They wanted a liberal bourgeois democracy in China. They wanted to wear Nikes and stuff like that. Okay, Deng Xiaoping delivered them all that shit anyway. But there are also like actual Maoists, actual real revolutionary communists. Like, here's the thing: like, this thing involved millions and millions of people. Okay, in cities, in townships all across China. Like, this was a mass movement. So it wasn't just in Beijing. So we have to keep that in mind. Like, in every protest movement, there's going to be a variety of opinions. There's going to be a variety of political lines that are being bandied about. So there were communists at Tiananmen Square. Why? Because a lot of people did not like the way that China was going. They didn't like the reform and opening up. They didn't like the fact that Chinese people were being subjected to what ended up being a new authoritarian neoliberal regime. So there were people who were correct at Tiananmen Square. This does not mean that I back the people who want a color revolution, okay? Just like there were communists and anarchists involved in the Maidan protests. This doesn't mean that I support Azov and Right Sector and all these other weirdos, okay? Like, shit's complicated. Like, even in the United States, like at Occupy, there are a bunch of weird anti-vax assholes. In the George Floyd and Ferguson movement, there were weirdos that came just to start shit. Like in George Floyd, you had the fucking Boogaloo Boys out. Like, basically portraying Tiananmen Square as being the sole province of a bunch of wannabe Vladimir Zelenskys, like, that's kind of wrong. That would be like portraying the George Floyd uprising as the province solely of the Boogaloo Boys. Like, we have to be dialectical. We have to understand these things in their full depth.
It's implied that this man is ran over by the tank never happened. Instead, he climbs atop, opens the hatch, and starts chatting with the soldiers. In popular media, the widely recognized narrative of the Tiananmen Square massacre is typically presented as follows. In June of 1989, the Chinese government imposed martial law and deployed the military to quell a pro-democracy and freedom protest led by students. Troops and tanks entered Tiananmen Square and opened fire on unarmed protesters, resulting in the deaths and injuries of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Some of the more exaggerated versions of the story include claims of tanks crushing students and machine guns being fired into the crowd, with bodies littering the square. All of the above is a lie. It never happened. So what did? Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor that partnered with MyHeritage. MyHeritage is the leading global service for family history. 16 billion records at your fingertips, so even if you don't know much about your family origins, MyHeritage can find a brand new family member for you as well.
It's hilarious. I understand Hakeem has to get paid, but it's hilarious how, like, you have communist YouTubers and communist video essayists who are like, oh, before I talk about the necessity of the bloody suppression at Tiananmen Square, you want to learn who raped your ancestors?
As well as records of ancestors with very little effort. Sign up for a 14 days. Okay, first some background. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the late 70s shook up China's economy by introducing free market reforms, creating large gaps between the rich and poor, unsurprisingly, and bringing...
Well, it's good that he acknowledges this. See, a lot of people don't like Hakeem. Okay, because they don't really understand Hakeem. Like, Hakeem at least tries to be somewhat unbiased. Like, do you have any idea how many white dudes we get on here and just be like, oh yeah, smash all the color revolutionists? So I'm glad that Hakeem actually, like, he's approaching Mao Zedong thought here. Like, he actually acknowledges that the reform and opening up made shit hard on a lot of working class people in China. Very good, Hakeem. Thank you.
Bringing with it some very blatant forms of corruption. These reforms likewise scaled back welfare programs and relaxed price controls. This massively benefited Chinese farmers, of which there are a lot, and led to increased crop yields and spending by them, which, predictably in a market economy, caused inflation.
Is he going to talk about how Deng also broke up the collective farming model? Because that's kind of important. William Hinton talks about it in Through the Looking Glass and The Great Reversal, I think.
Inflation, mostly affecting urban dwellers. Students and urbanites expressed a certain sense of superiority, you could call it, over rural citizens, and were not happy to see peasants and farmers do better than them, even less so foreigners. Following cuts to tuition subsidies, students began protesting the presence of African exchange students. Like most foreign students, the Africans enjoyed greater standards of living in China, and some dated local women. Among the signs in the crowd at Heihai on Christmas Eve, 1988, were placards demanding greater democracy, alongside ones proclaiming "Death to the Black Devils."
This is sad because Mao actually leaned heavily on support from Black Americans. Like there was a song that was literally titled "Black Americans Want Freedom." So yeah, this was a major reversal. But it's also an example of the superstructure impacting the base. Like you have all of these, the base impacting the superstructure. I'm sorry. See, I'm a horrible Maoist. But so you have all of these economic changes, and then you have people that start hating Black people now. Like 10 years before in 78, or 20 years before in 68, if a Black person had went to China, they would have been feasted, feted. They'd have been received as basically revolutionaries and representatives of the new world and birth. We were seen as revolutionaries within the belly of the beast. We were going to be the people who bring down Yankee imperialism. I mean, we still are. But you have all these reforms that come, and nobody gave a shit about stuff like that anymore. Nobody gave a shit about the building of a railway in Tanzania. Nobody gave a shit about the struggle against imperialism. It was all get mine, fuck everybody else. That's what happens when you transition from socialism back into raw, naked, unabashed capitalism. That's why you don't do that.
I don't think you've ever seen this in any of the commemorations. The political discussion of the era was very complex and spanned the entire political spectrum. Of course, that's not surprising. China is a massive country. The liberal narrative, though, centers on Hu Yaobang, a popular reform leader who at that point had been a key advocate for political liberalization within the Chinese government. His sudden death on April 15, 1989, sparked student protests, as many within that particular movement saw his demise as the end of a hope for Western-style liberal political reform. In the following days, the
thing is, why the fuck would you want Western-style liberal political reform? That shit sucks. What do you want? You want two parties that trade power like a fucking horse race every few years? Why would you want that? You literally during the Cultural Revolution, if your boss was an asshole, you literally had the power to drag him out with the dunce cap on his head and a placard calling him a piece of shit. Why would you want to replace that with the Democrats and Republicans? Why would you want the CCP to be a social democratic chamber of commerce type deal, and you want the Kuomintang to come back? Is that what you want? What possible benefit does that have? That would be going from driving a Maserati to driving a fucking Ford Pinto. It's not going to be a good time. Why would you downgrade yourself like that? You already had the dopest system in the world.
The China Democratic Alliance, a US-based organization which wanted the outright establishment of capitalism in China, issued an open letter to Chinese university students, which was posted at many Beijing schools at the time, advising that the complete negation of the anti-liberalization movement of 1987 should be used as a breakthrough point. For those that can't read between the lines, this is a subtle call for regime change from a foreign government. How fun. Regardless, students of a particular class background began to gather in Tiananmen Square to mourn Hu Yaobang and voice their frustrations with the government. This subsection of protesters, which the Western press overwhelmingly focused on, demanded, on paper, Western-style democracy, government accountability, and civil liberties like freedom of the press and speech, largely inspired by Hu. In reality, their interests were different and their demands were different. These weren't representatives of the collective will of China, but instead a layer of the intelligentsia who wanted to be elevated and given more privileges, such as more political power and higher wages in their subsequent careers.
The funny thing is that Deng's reform actually opened up the possibility of these people even existing in the first place. Like during the Mao era, like you would not have done very well like being a red princeling. A red princeling is basically somebody that uses their clout, or their parents' clout rather, to do very well in Chinese society. Like you have access to contracts, you have access to state-owned property that you can loot, stuff like that. Like a lot of these Chinese kids that come over to the United States to go to college, and you see them, they wear Gucci and drive Benzes and all this shit. Like those are the children of red princelings. Okay, their great grandpa made the long march with Mao, and then during the Dung reform era, they got rich as fuck. Yeah. So you have a new ruling class, just like Mao predicted, that arose from out of the belly of the Communist Party. And like during the Cultural Revolution, like the Red Guards who were most hardcore, like they were literally going around beating up people because their great granddad owned a little piece of land. It was called bloodline theory. Like Jiangqing read it for filth in front of the Red Guards themselves. But certain people, like they thought that their bloodline made them holy. Basically, once a bastard, always a bastard. Thankfully, Mao and Jiangqing and other representatives of the proletarian revolutionary line within the party put an end to that. But Deng's reforms allowed these people to come right out into the open, just like Khrushchev's reforms and Brezhnev's inadequacy allowed the nomenclatura to basically turn the Soviet Union into their own little network of private fiefdoms. Like all of these oligarchs in Russia, many of their dads and granddads had very, very large amounts of clout within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union fell apart, they basically parceled out state property, well, former state property, amongst themselves, and became billionaires pretty much overnight. You also had the Russian mafia, which also had ties to the old CPSU. Never mind the bands of mercenaries that are still bandying about Africa and Central Asia and places like that. So, yeah, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical disaster of catastrophic proportions.
When workers organized alongside them, students treated them with contempt. Despite their alliance on the square, educational and class differences continually hampered their relations. These students were not, after all, Lao Baixing, meaning common people. They exhibited awareness about the articulation of economic demands by other groups and wanted to keep the movement exclusively under their control.
That sounds kind of like the reformists and NGO types that show up at every major black protest against somebody that's been killed by the police. Like your peace police, your cops, well, wannabe cops, the people that get interviews on MSNBC, the people that get to sit at forums with catered lunches hosted by Wells Fargo and Raytheon. Like, those are basically the equivalents of the bourgeois students at Tiananmen Square. Okay, these people show up. They think that they dominate everything. They think that the kids that are throwing the Molotovs and the bricks and breaking into stores, they think that they're trash, basically. They don't want them. They don't want people like that in power. The government doesn't want people like that in power. Whereas in China, you had the masses of working people who were putting in economic demands. They're like, hey, this reform and opening up shit, it's no good. Why don't we have the right to strike anymore? Why don't we have the authority to put up Dashabao like we used to? Why can't we struggle against our bosses? Why is capitalism being restored in China? Like, if Tiananmen Square was strictly about that, then it would have been dope. But just like in the United States, you had this handful of NGO wannabes. You had this handful of wannabe capitalist ruling class weirdos and freaks that basically were propped up by the U.S., just like the U.S. government props up people like Patrice Cullors and D. Ray McKesson. God, I hate that dude in his fucking Patagonia puffer jacket. Anyways, the U.S. government props up people like this because they are in line with U.S. government desires. The U.S. government doesn't want a strong socialist China. The U.S. government wants a China that's broken up, that's weak, and is able to be manipulated and controlled. So of course they're going to back these students. They were going to give them the China that they had always wanted.
They would go on to cordon off their marches from those who weren't students or so-called intellectuals afterwards. What started as a small gathering grew into a larger protest, with up to 1 million people joining in, though that was only at the very height. Towards the end of the protests, it would have been less than a tenth of that. Students set up makeshift camps, organized speeches, and created posters and banners displaying a wide variety of political positions, many of which including differing flavors of Marxism. Interesting that student encampments in the US aren't very popular politically. That can't possibly be hypocrisy. Anyways, despite the festive atmosphere, there was an underlying tension, and on April 19th, a number of protesters attempted to storm Zhongnanhai, the headquarters of the party. This, along with certain very clear calls for the overthrow of the government by liberal student leaders, got the government's attention, unsurprisingly. Many more developments, including a struggle within the party itself, increased the seriousness of the movement more than the students themselves had realized. It would take an hour to go over the specifics, so refer to the articles at the beginning of the video if you're interested. Regardless, martial law was declared over the area, but troops failed to arrive in Tiananmen Square in the middle of May because of roadblocks the students had set up around the city, and since the troops had orders to avoid violent confrontations, particularly with the students, it was difficult to enter the city as planned. Despite these,
Imagine like this just shows like how the Chinese government at that point still responded like to the whims of the people. Imagine if in Ferguson or at Columbia during the protests a few months ago, imagine the cops not being ordered to fight the students, or shit at UCLA where they literally had a Zionist mob beating the shit out of everybody and destroying the encampment. Like they literally tried to burn the motherfucker down. They tried to burn down half the fucking school. Like imagine if that was simply not allowed. Like imagine if American troops and American cops actually got in trouble for crimes they committed against regular people. Imagine that. Like even at its worst, China is still a shitload better than the United States. Like, how the fuck are you going to have a country in which freedom of speech is guaranteed under the Constitution, yet if the speech is not liked by Baroness Schiffach and the people who pay her and the people who own her school, then they're going to summon the NYPD to literally break your encampment up. And they literally fired a gunshot inside of one of those buildings. Yeah. Never mind the atrocities and bullshit that we saw in Chicago last week for the horrible Democratic National Convention. There is no freedom of speech. There is no democracy in the United States. It's all a farce.
Despite these martial law regulations, though, the Chinese media allowed Western press to continue to make use of its transmission facilities. So much for a dictatorship, I guess. On May 27th, the Federation of College Students decided to represent their movement with a symbol, which was a plaster reconstruction of, I shit you not, the Statue of Liberty in Tiananmen Square. As if you needed any more information about where their ideological underpinnings lie. All this will become clear very soon. CIA cables gloated about how they wish this would anger the Chinese leadership, and in vague terms may have even ordered it. How about some more proof? Liu Xiaobo, a major protest leader who just 1 year prior called for the outright overthrow of the Chinese government, the institution of complete market reforms, and the replacement of Chinese culture with modern culture, read Western culture, that's what he meant, would arrive back in China from New York just in time for the protest.
He wasn't even living in China, and China is a several thousand-year-old culture. Why the fuck would you want to replace and destroy your own culture, your own people's culture, with what, Pizza Hut, mass alcoholism, gambling? Well, gambling has always kind of been a problem in China, but like, why would you want to replace your ancient culture? Like, you should be proud of that shit, bro. And you want to replace it with what, Las Vegas? You want a fucking big ass McDonald's in Tiananmen Square? Like, what? Why would you do that?
The protests and would now call for armed struggle against the Chinese government. His reverse weeabooing for the West doesn't stop there, by the way. He's on record saying it would take 300 years of colonialism to transform China. In 100 years of colonialism, Hong Kong has changed to what we see today. With China being so big, of course it would require 300 years as a colony for it to be able to transform.
Malcolm was wrong. They didn't take out every Uncle Tom Chinese person.
Into how Hong Kong is today. I have my doubts as to whether 300 years would be enough. Yikes. Since the beginning of June, following 2 months of on and off protests, troops slowly made their way into Beijing. A number of these troops moved towards Tiananmen Square. The troops continued their negotiations and almost reached an agreement with the students that would have ended the protests. But this was sabotaged by the more radical, violent elements of those same liberal protest leaders looking for a fight, not a solution.
Oh, come on, Hakeem. Don't tell me you don't get hard at the sound of broken glass and you don't get hard at the smell of smoke from fires like I do. Come on.
On the morning of June 3rd, more attacks were made on military vehicles. Reporters for Time magazine stated, by 7 a.m., though, students and young workers outside Zhongnan High were smashing their way into 2 military buses filled with light machine guns and crates of ammunition. As for isolated pockets of troops hemmed in at the intersections and overpasses around the city, the crowd was not in a mood to merely lecture them. In some places, the troops were stripped.
Again, restraint. Like, imagine American soldiers or American cops having this restraint. Like, they still, like the Chinese army, they still took that serve the people shit seriously. Like, it was literally the motto of their army. So there was no, like, even during the Cultural Revolution, like when students and little red guards were beating the shit out of them, like they would literally just link arms and be like, do not use violence, comrades. Shit, in America, you'd have been stomped the fuck out. Like, even if one of you guys threw a brick.
Were stripped almost naked.
Like, it's wild, the contrast between a semi-socialist form of government, semi-socialist cops and semi-socialist soldiers, and outwardly fascist soldiers.
Chased or struck by angry citizens. Other injured troops had difficulty getting to hospitals as mobs deflated or slashed the tires of military ambulances. This isn't the least of it. I'm not going to show any of the footage, but the violence reached such a point that unarmed soldiers were burned alive. Some calculations have up to half the dead being PLA soldiers trapped in their armored personnel carriers, buses, and tanks as the vehicles were torched.
Ouch.
Others were killed and brutally mutilated by protesters with various implements. These events that actually happened are instead overshadowed by mythical tanks running over people in tents, which never happened. Only after this did the government respond with violence in turn. The decision was made to bring in the troops which remained outside Beijing. At 6:30 on the night of June 3rd, the announcement was made around Beijing that people should remain in their neighborhoods and stay away from Tiananmen Square. Around midnight, soldiers stationed about 3 miles west of the square are said to have started firing indiscriminately at unarmed civilians in the streets. Chang'an Boulevard in particular became the scene of intense and brutal confrontations. People staying at the Beijing Hotel, close to the square, reported seeing troops open fire on unarmed citizens who were too far away to pose any real threat. This is, however, countered by other Western reporting and comments from protesters that said no indiscriminate firing ever occurred. Estimates suggest that between 200 and 300 people, both civilian and military, were killed during these confrontations back and forth. A lot of the violence happened as troops tried to push through the barricades and crowds. As for the square itself, a Taiwan-born singer and composer, Hou Dejian, who joined the student protesters at the square and negotiated with the Chinese army commissar, said, "During the whole withdrawal process, I didn't see a single student, other citizens, or soldiers killed in the square, nor did I see any armored troop carriers rolling over people." Richard Ross from CBS News reported being held by Chinese troops while driving through the square and didn't see any bodies or signs of a massacre. Additionally, James Miles, BBC's Beijing correspondent, said, "There was violence in Beijing, but no massacre in the square itself." Accounts from diplomats are very similar. A Chilean diplomat inside the square noted that while there were sporadic gunshots, most troops had non-lethal gear like batons and clubs. This particular diplomat's account supports the view that there was no mass shooting in the square itself. Even US embassy cables, later released, or unwillingly released by WikiLeaks, confirmed that the worst violence happened outside the square, especially at Mushidi, 3 miles west. These accounts...
Oh, wow. So the United States government was lying to fuck with China. And like at American protests, like you could literally see them shooting rubber bullets or even live ammunition. Like if somebody says something happened in the United States, that should happen. But China is so hated and despised by the West that like they'll believe anything. Like they literally have you believing that the entire Uyghur ethnicity has been wiped out when that has not been the case.
Accounts from a diverse set of people and motivations challenges this widely held belief that there was a massacre within Tiananmen Square. The Chinese government always claimed no one was killed in the square, but they don't deny the serious violence and deaths that occurred in the surrounding areas.
Yeah.
These reports from Western diplomats and journalists back that up. The Chinese government's account of the events was initially dismissed as propaganda, of course, but turned out to be more or less correct. They reported about 300 deaths, which is true, including many soldiers of the PLA. In contrast, Western sources seemed to decide at random what the death toll was. They claimed and still claim that thousands had died, ranging from 2,600 to as high as 10,000 people. Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times suggested, basically by guessing, that about a dozen soldiers and policemen were killed, along with 400 to 800 civilians. On the 12th of June, 1989, the New York Times published an exhaustive but entirely fabricated eyewitness report describing brutal mass killings in the square. Eyewitness accounts and later investigations, though, revealed that the Chinese government's claims were basically correct. These inflated numbers and presentation were a part of a concerted effort by Western media to craft a very particular narrative. The typical brutal authoritarian regime committing horrific crimes against humanity because the leader.
Well, sounds kind of like the U.S. Like every accusation is a statement of guilt, basically. Like everything that the American government says that China or whoever else it's mad at is doing, they're pulling that out of their own fucking book. Okay? Well, we did this. They do it too. Like, come on. Like after 9/11, you literally had people wanting to put every single Muslim in the United States in a camp or worse. China is not doing that. Okay? Like there's no evidence of that happening. None whatsoever. But because America would like to do that, of course, everybody else wants to do it too. America is the most self-centered fucking country in existence. It actually cannot fathom the fact that other people don't do the horrible, fucked up things that we do.
The leadership of a particular country isn't a US puppet, and Western capital can't exploit local labor to the fullest while also stripping the country of all its natural resources for cheap.
You can do that now.
Israel never gets this kind of coverage in the American press. Why is that, I wonder? And if the West just making stuff up about the incident wasn't enough to completely discredit the grand myth they built, actually existing evidence in the form of aerial photos of the conflict zone showed over 100 military trucks and armored vehicles torched, lynched PLA soldiers, and, most shockingly of all, demonstrators actually stripping the automatic rifles off of soldiers who put up no fight. Yes, seriously. Tells a wildly.
Imagine walking up to an American soldier or an American cop and grabbing his gun and they don't even fight you. Like this is socialist discipline right here.
Different story insofar as telling the truth about the incident is concerned. But do you see just how far from the truth the Western telling of the story is? Well, if you've been keeping up with the news at all, none of this should be any surprise to you. This is an important note. Many of those killed by the army were in the western part of Beijing and on the way to the square, not in it. This may sound like a distinction without a difference, but it's not. Tiananmen Square is enclosed enough that the image conveyed by claiming there was a massacre in the square is one of shooting fish in a barrel, which is to say that it implies the soldiers were just blindly shooting into a restricted mass of people, which is horrific, but isn't what happened. Now,
that actually is what American cops did during the 60s and 70s uprisings, though. Like you literally just had a national, like the default response to an uprising or a riot in, say, Chicago or LA in circa 1964, 1965 was just had the National Guard come in and bayonet everybody or shoot everybody. That's what Americans did.
The Tiananmen Square massacre has become a massive Mandela effect moment, a collective false memory, pushed by Western media despite numerous reports and eyewitness accounts to the contrary. So what really happened that day? Well, for starters, this protest was not as spontaneous as it appeared. In the days leading up to the confrontation, the US government was actively involved in promoting the pro-democracy protests through a well-funded, internationally coordinated propaganda machine, much of which came from Voice of America. The protests were also not one ideological trend, but...
You know, I constantly see, like, various types of social democrats cite Voice of America as an objective source. No, that is propaganda. Like, literal propaganda. Nothing they say is true. If what they say has a grain of truth, it is hilariously embellished. Voice of America is not a source. Okay? Like, were I a professor and you cited Voice of America as one of your sources in a paper, I would literally give you an F just right off flip. I'm sorry. That's like citing Alex Jones.
But representative of a broad spectrum from working-class Maoists upset with Deng's reforms to liberal urban elites hoping that political reform would bring with it asset speculation and Western-like managerial salaries, and to hell with democracy if it suited them. Guess which section the Western press focused on? Where Kai-shi, a leader of the protest, said it in even plainer terms. So, what do we want? Nike shoes, lots of free time to take our girlfriends to the bar, the freedom to discuss an issue with someone, and get a little respect from society.
Yeah, so basically the full return of the baby bourgeoisie to power. That's what they wanted. Well, that's what this section of the protesters that Americans focused on, that's what they wanted. Why did America focus on these people? Because they wanted to turn China basically into huge America. No, they wanted to turn they wanted to turn China into a huge version of the Philippines. Basically a place where they go to get cheap labor and they have a handful of people like Wu Jiaxi to run the country on their behalf. That's what they want. They don't want a strong Communist Party of China. See, the reason why America continues to hate China, even though China basically being a capitalist country, is because it's still run by a party that professes some semblance of socialist values. And for two, it's not under the thumb of the US. It has its own very large military. It has its nuclear weapons. It has its aircraft carriers. And the United States can't bully and kick it around like it did Iraq or Grenada or Panama or any of these other small countries. Same thing with Iran. You can't pick on fucking Iran. Okay? Iran has their own shit. Iran is giving Israel the blues right now, or groups supported by Iran are. So, yeah, America hates anybody that it can bully and bend to its will.
Lofty ideals, clearly. When soldiers who were not given any orders upon arriving on the scene and
I still love those fucking uniforms. I'm not a LARPer, but like, I love those uniforms.
entered the square on June 4th, 1989, they didn't.
Only thing I would say is that the Sam Brown belt that this guy has, like, I'm a sucker for green uniforms and dark brown Sam Brown belts. I don't know why. Maybe it's the Maoist in me.
Didn't swarm in, guns blazing. No, instead, a small group of soldiers showed up, unarmed, and spoke with student leaders. More troops arrived, and negotiations were eventually interrupted by violence called for from liberal radicals in the crowd, who would go on Western interviews calling for bloodshed because it was supposedly the only thing that would bring change. So again, while most people were there in good faith and looking for mild reforms, people like Chai Ling, that you saw in the beginning of the video, had ulterior motives.
Also, I find it hilarious that like liberals in the United States are like remarkably weak. Like, these people are not violent whatsoever. They're not a threat to anybody whatsoever. The worst thing they'll do is call the cops on you, which I guess is violent. But like in China, you literally had liberals throwing down with fucking automatic weapons and Molotov cocktails. You literally had violent liberals in China. Yeah. Imagine violent liberals in the US. Imagine our little Freikorps here.
Motives. She admitted in an interview that the goal was to provoke the government into a violent crackdown with the hope that it would topple the Communist Party. Oddly similar to the desires of the US, I couldn't possibly understand why. She not only called for bloodshed, but thought that she herself was too important and that she should leave the square should any violence happen. How quaint. She's also on tape talking racist nonsense about how the Chinese aren't worth the effort. Additionally, reports from the time describe how these liberal anti-government fighters were highly organized and grouped themselves into formations of 100 to 150 people around the square, not inside it. They armed themselves with Molotov cocktails and iron clubs to use against the still unarmed PLA. Once the confrontations escalated, the deaths began, starting with dozens of soldiers and later protesters. Want to know the most interesting bit? A fanciful documentary titled The Gate of Heavenly Peace was made in the 90s, of course funded by the US government, Ford, and the Rockefeller Foundation. In it, they
if any organization that you work for or any organization that you deal with is funded by either one of these organizations, you need to like not have any dealings with them. Like a lot of groups, so-called protest groups, nonprofits, whatever, in the United States are funded in major part by the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation. Stay the fuck away from those people. Like, I understand that if you need a paycheck real quick, but like, don't ever like trust in the ideological strength of any of those groups. Okay. Ford and Rockefeller.
They rehash the liberal mythology of what happened, but within the interviews which they're trying to use to support the fictitious series of events, the protest leaders admit to, amongst other things, 1. Foreign funding and support, 2. The desire to overthrow the government, 3. Political suppression of liberals by other liberals within the protests themselves, so much for democracy, 4. Them admitting to lying about bloodshed on the square, and specifically the tanks rolling over people part, 5. Weird racism about Chinese people not being ready for democracy, not having the brain for it, and other cringe, and
what are you talking about? Like, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was probably one of the greatest manifestations. That's a new word. Manifestations of people's democracy, of working class democracy in the history of the world. Like, when a lot of people in the West talk about democracy, they're talking about basically the shit we got in the United States or the shit they have in Europe. Like, the ruling class runs everything and you get to go you get to go bubble in a little circle every few years. That's not democracy, okay? If the same people that ruled you yesterday are ruling you today, that's not democracy. What are you voting for? Whoever you vote for in the United States is going to represent who? The ruling class. And don't talk to me about PSL, the Green Party, the Socialist Party. Like, none of those groups are ever going to get in power. Have you been following what's going on in France right now? Like, have you? What's going on in France right now? So, big left-wing blowout in France a couple months ago, right? But look at what Prime Minister Macron did.
Another
President Macron.
busy day for the French president, who was
He literally met with Marine Le Pen, the leader of the fascist party in her country. Before he acknowledges the left-wing victory or turns over power to a left-wing government or a left-wing prime minister, he would rather sit down and break bread with, like, the queen of fascists in France.
has hosted a string of party leaders at the Elysee since Friday in hopes of finding a candidate for prime minister that would not immediately be toppled in a confidence vote. But that is exactly what the far-right's Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella said they planned on doing if the candidate and the government came from the left-wing New Popular Front.
This is exactly what's going to happen if DSA or PSL or the Socialist Party or the Greens win an election in the United States. They're going to get together and they're going to fuck it up. They're not going to let a serious hardliner leftist take power in the United States. Like, are you mad? This is the most bourgeois country. Like, this country never had a feudal stage. Well, I guess the argument can be made that the South did have a feudal stage. You literally had massive plantations worked by first slaves and then sharecroppers. But anyways, this country, like, literally was bourgeois from its inception. Like, this is the first 100% bourgeois country in the world. You really think that they're going to allow a serious communist to take power in this country? You are a fool. You are a fool, okay? France has a stronger left-wing heritage than the United States, by far. So does most of Europe. Yeah, most of those parties never end up being shit, but still, like, left-wing theory, left-wing culture, like in Italy and Greece, there are literally football teams in which the fandom is almost entirely left-wing, okay? Where's an American football team or an American baseball team or an American anything team that has a communist, like a hardcore, will fuck you up, will fight you in the stands fan base, a hardcore leftist fan base? It's not to be found, because the culture of America is antithetical to anything leftist. That's how bourgeois this country is.
So we've asked for an extraordinary session to be opened so that the Prime Minister, whoever it is, can appear before the National Assembly.
The New Popular Front, in its programme, movement and figures that personify it, today represents a danger. We will defend the country from a government that will divide French society.
Isn't that what you guys are doing? Like, aren't you guys, like, trying to drive every immigrant out of the country despite them? Like, did you guys see the French Olympics opening ceremony? The French Olympics closing ceremony? Like, 7 out of 10 of the performers there were black people or brown people. Have you seen the French soccer team? Have you seen the French anything team? Who sang La Marseillaise? La Marseillaise, however the fuck you pronounce it, the French national anthem. Who were both of the French Olympics torchbearers? They were two Guadeloupe. So what do you mean divide French society? Like, what do you want? Nothing but and baguettes and calvados? Like, your country is a diverse one because you all had a diverse empire. If you didn't want it to be that way, you shouldn't have had an empire. Let's go back to the questions. How are all of these transitory forces energized, and how does the process of change run its course if the dictatorship has its eyes set on combating modern revisionism? I hope you're referring to the dictatorship of the proletariat, because that's the only context in which we as communists acknowledge a dictatorship, okay? Like, dictatorships are class things. Like, in the United States and in Europe, we live in dictatorships of the bourgeoisie. We live in dictatorships of the bourgeoisie. So a dictatorship of the proletariat is the dictatorship, the will, the writ of the working class that has nothing to lose but its chains. Socialism is the rule of the people, the rule of the lowest and deepest masses of the working class. So how does the process of change run its course if the dictatorship has its eyes set on combating modern revisionism? So first, what is modern revisionism? Modern revisionism is basically any attempt to move away from the truth that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, that you can transition back from socialism to capitalism non-violently. Like, if you ignore basic Maoist dictums for whatever reason that history has proven to be true, like China has reverted to capitalism and social imperialism, and the USSR reverted to capitalism and social imperialism and then collapsed after it waged this stupid war. So everything that Maoists predicted has come true. Am I saying that other ideological trends don't have anything of importance to teach us? No. That doesn't make me a revisionist. That just acknowledges that other people can be right too. Like, I do not think that Maoists possess the philosopher's stone. I don't think that we're right about everything. Like, in terms of foreign policy, we tend to take quite a few L's. But broadly, I would say that we've been correct more often than not. That's why I'm a Maoist, because it makes sense to explain like why China has billionaires despite calling itself socialist. It explains why Russia is doing what it does. Like, socialist countries don't send bands of mercenaries to Mali, okay? But I don't think even the most insane mega communist weirdos would consider modern day Russia socialist. Like, Putin blames the Bolshevik Party and Lenin for the existence of the Ukrainian state in the first place. So, back to your question. I mean, we root ourselves in the people, okay? Like, where a lot of socialists and a lot of communists go wrong is that we act as if everything revolves around us, that the people exist to serve us. No, we exist to serve the people. So if the people are dissatisfied, the people have the right to rebel. Okay, like, that's a Maoist dictum. It is right to rebel. It doesn't mean that it's right to rebel when the party tells you to. No, it is right to rebel means that if the state is doing some fucked up shit, like if the state has abolished your right to strike, if the state has shot your uncle for trying to organize a union in his workplace, then you have the right to fight that shit by any means necessary. Like, Malcolm's dictum doesn't stop being right just because we're in a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, there's still going to be fucked up shit because socialism, especially in a country like the United States that has been bourgeois from the womb, is an inherently flawed process. It still has the mark of capitalism stamped on it. And that's why cultural revolution is necessary to uproot those bad things, to uproot those weeds before they grow really, really tall and choke the life out of the socialist system. So, to answer your question in short, the process of change runs through the people. The people still have the right to vote. They can elect people who represent their views and represent their interests. Like, there's still going to be a legislative body under socialism. There's not going to be a dictatorship of one person. The parliament or Congress or whatever we call it, it's not just going to be a rubber stamp. Like, it can't be like that. Because, for one, in the United States, people won't accept that. Like, Americans are very cynical people. Americans are very hard to bullshit people at the lowest levels. So Americans won't go for some shit like that. Like, Americans, I really don't see embracing a hardcore Stalin type system. That's not going to work. There's too many guns here, for one. So the process of change runs its course through the people, and it's going to be constant all the way up through communism. Shit, during communism. Any good reads for someone new to Maoism? Well, the piece that I read from the beginning, the MLM Basic Course. I also recommend all of Bao Yu Qing's works. She'll really give you a nice basis in political economy. all of William Hinton's works, Bettelheim, and Sweezy. So yeah, anything from those authors. I especially like Bettelheim's Class Struggle in the USSR. He also did a really nice piece on the Cultural Revolution. Now I sound like a deranged librarian. And there's a lot of other stuff that I'm forgetting, but I think I have a book list somewhere. Cultural Revolution and Industrial Organization in China. There we go. I'm not going to read all of this, but it basically it talks about the general knitwear factory and how relations of production were revolutionized during the Cultural Revolution process. So it wasn't just kids running around beating up their teachers. Like, you actually had really, really big changes for working class people that took place during this period. Same question. You all love your books. Let me see if I can pull up my book list. Do you all even be reading this shit, or do you all just ask me for book recommendations to sound smart? Shit, what did I just do? There we go. There we go. An anti-revisionist reading list. Share this tab instead. There we go. So yeah, I did an anti-revisionist reading list last May. So you've got this. It's an anarchist journal, but it really is good at talking about not anarchist. It's a collective of communists. I just said anarchist because it's in AK Press. But anyways, it talks a lot about like class struggle in China. I don't know if they're left comms or what, but it's really good. I highly recommend their stuff. You've also got I already mentioned Hinton, The Great Reversal, Rethinking Socialism, What is Socialist Transition by Dongyan Xu and Baoyu Qing, and a bunch of other stuff that you can read at your leisure. But yeah, there's a lot of Maoist theory out there, even going all the way back to the period in which Mao was alive. Like, is Yugoslavia a socialist country? Peaceful coexistence, two diametrically opposed policies. On Khrushchev's phony communism and its historical lessons for the world. The piece that I just showed you, Cultural Revolution and Industrial Organization in China, Changes in Management and the Division of Labor, The Great Leap Backward, on exercising all-round dictatorship over the bourgeoisie, on the transition to socialism from victory to defeat, and on the Communist Party of China. So all are really, really good texts. You're not going to read them in a few months, but after you do, I think you'll have an understanding of Maoism. As a matter of fact, I think you'll be a Maoist. Just for your information, Hoxha is pronounced Hoja or Hoja. Albanian has a bit of an unusual way of spelling some things. So, thank you. What is your opinion on the January storm? So, the January storm is basically the high point of the Cultural Revolution, if you will, because the ruling class, the ruling party officials in Shanghai didn't necessarily like the Cultural Revolution. So, the masses rebelled and instituted what was called the Shanghai Commune, even though Mao did not like this name, because he was like, okay, so if everybody's going to have a commune, why don't we just call ourselves the People's Commune of China? Anyways, there was a bit of mishandling, a bit of confusion. Here's the thing. Yes, the Cultural Revolution was more often than not chaotic, but you have to keep in mind, like, the Russian Civil War was chaotic. The founding of socialism in the USSR was chaotic. Like, anytime that something is tried for the first time, just like a baby taking its first steps, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be chaotic. But I think the January storm was dope. I think it was the high point of the Cultural Revolution. And again, I think it was the closest that that we as human beings have marched towards communism in our few 100,000 years of existence. So I like the January storm. I think it could have been carried out better. I think it should have spread throughout the country, but it's faced. Would I recommend other Maoists join DSA? Well, I wouldn't do something that I wouldn't recommend other people do. So yes, I would recommend other Maoists join DSA. Yeah, I think you'll like it here. Like, it's certainly a lot better than some of these little small, weird cultist reading groups or spray paint collectors or whatever the fuck you all are doing. So yeah. I think Deng Xiaoping was more influenced by his experience in capitalist France and all of Marxist theory. He was heavily inspired by Bukharin. Like, Bukharin was part of the Run opposition. He basically wanted the new economic program to run forever. And whenever you talk to a hardcore Dungist who actually knows what they're talking about, they always cite Bukharin. Like, I hate Bukharin. I hate him because he had red hair, and I hate him because he wanted to basically turn the Soviet Union into a giant authoritarian social democracy. But for some reason, economics nerds always end up being rightists. I don't know why. When the revolution comes, what will we do about DJ Vlad and Vlad TV? Execution. No question about it. I'm not a fan of chopping off people's heads, but that motherfucker needs his head chopped off. He has started so much shit amongst black people, it's ridiculous. DJs represent a class collaboration. This group will all be executed by Red Guard squads. Now, second Maoists come to power. Oh, dear. The truth is that both the Communist Party of China and Westerners lie about Tiananmen Square. Western media represents protests as a cry against the CPC. They were a cry against the CPC and desire for a Western model, while CPC represents it as exclusively a color revolution. Both sides ignore the fact that most protesters were supporting Maoist policies and therefore were protesting dumb reform. So yeah, it was a cry against the right turn of the CPC. Hakeem was actually pretty nuanced. Like, people have weird reactions to that guy. Like, I don't hate him. I think that he's wrong a lot of times, but I don't hate the guy. I don't hate anybody. But there's very, very few people that I hate except for Bad Empanada. How might understanding China's actually existing socialism, the ML position, versus a state capitalist neoliberal state, or whatever the MLM position is, impact my organizing priorities within the imperial core and my community? It won't. It won't. Like, your position on China really doesn't mean anything when it's time to organize a tenant strike, or when it's time to organize a union at your workplace, or when it comes time to do anything in this country, okay? Like, the average American doesn't go around day to day thinking about shit that's going on in China. Okay, these are all theoretical debates within the left, within the communist movement. It's still important to have them because we're not anti-intellectuals. Like, we should not have a position on China, but we should not spend most of our time. Like, I get irritated at leftists that think that anti-imperialism is just dick riding China and dick riding all of these other countries. Okay, like, no. Like, what power do you have when you say I support China? What does that mean? It means nothing. You don't have an army. You don't have nuclear weapons. You don't have aircraft carriers. You don't have billions of people. China does. China can defend itself very well. Or, I defend Comrade Stalin. Like, what are you talking about? Stalin is skin and bones right now. He's a corpse. And when he was alive, he had the NKVD, he had the Cheka, he had Schmerz spying on him, death to spies. He had the Red Army, millions and millions of soldiers. He doesn't need you to defend him. He can defend himself. He had the Comintern. So, yeah, it's just LARP. That's what it is. But still, you should still study situations that have taken place in other countries, and you should still develop positions on previous revolutionary experiments, but don't make that the sum total of your organizing. Have I and Hakeem ever collaborated? No, we have not. I would be open to it, but no, we have not. Why do I support the DSA? Genuinely asking. Well, I'm a DSA member because I think that as the largest socialist organization in the United States, it has the most potential for elements of a vanguard to appear. And also, I've met some pretty cool people, and I've done some pretty cool work, like canvassing for Cory Bush. So, like, a lot of hardliners, a lot of hard leftists have a pretty shitty position on DSA. I think that it's just a whole bunch of social democrats. And yes, there are social democrats still in the organization. Many of them call themselves democratic socialists. And yes, they're very annoying to deal with, but they're also my comrades. And we should struggle with our comrades as opposed to simply writing them off as enemies of the people. What are good starter books from Maoists? I've already covered that. Will Mao let us smoke loud pack? I don't give a shit what you smoke. Mao is dead. Like if you depend on a dead man for whether or not you can smoke weed, then there's something wrong with you. I don't give a shit about people smoking weed. It's an herb. Opinion of Hungary in 1956. Can leftists watch porn without guilt? I'm of the position that most pornography is developed through immense exploitation. Like I've listened to comrades who used to work in that industry. I've listened to comrades who have done porn before. I've listened to comrades who have been around that industry, and it is an extremely exploitative industry. My opinion of Hungary in 1956, I've actually read the demands of those people, of the people who did the uprising. And yeah, the uprising was, there were fascists in that uprising. Like we shouldn't delude ourselves, but by and large, most of those people just wanted they wanted a more open way of doing things. They didn't want to be a puppet state of the USSR. That's kind of fair. Okay. And like all of the Hungarian comrades, even the Hungarian Maoists that I've talked to, they're like, yeah, Russia fucked up there. And it's funny that Mao supported the suppression in Hungary in 1956, but in 1968, when they did basically the same thing in Czechoslovakia, when they suppressed the Prague Spring, Mao was like, oh, boo, Soviet social imperialism. So it'll be consistent, my guy. It's rather funny how even Chiang Kai-shek is becoming more popular in Chinese historiography than in Taiwan. He's not seen as a negative figure anymore by Chinese scholars. Yeah, most Taiwanese people, if I recall correctly, think that Chiang Kai-shek was basically a dictator. I had a Chinese professor of history who was by no means a communist, who essentially laid out that the vast majority of people at Tiananmen Square were from Maoist thought, and the Western media just focused on a minority who wanted Coca-Cola. Of course, they're not going to prioritize the Maoists. Hi, BRG. Can I ask you what you have seen from socialist alternative in the U.S.? I don't think socialist alternative is a thing in the U.S. anymore, is it? Like they came to St. Louis during the Ferguson uprising. They had a branch year, and they did pretty good for like 2 or 3 years, and then they fell apart over Bernie, if I recall correctly. Are they ineffective? I've never been a member. I've never been a member of Socialist Alternative. But they did elect one alderwoman, Kshama Sawant, in Seattle. So I guess by American leftist standards, that's great success. That they're a trot party. So take it for what it is. Compradors will always treat the culture of settlers' colonialist regime as inherently better and more advanced than semi-colonized countries. That is true. That's why you have all those black Englishmen running around in Africa. You know, they still make their judges wear those red fucking suits and those wigs. What were my thoughts on when Justice Democrats were created after the 2016 election? Well, you still have Democrat in your name, my guy. You're not going to do very well. Like, you can't change the Democrats. The Democrats are going to change you. What other questions? Hakeem is a cool guy. He'd probably really be happy to hang out with you on a stream sometime. Maybe we can make it a thing. Let's see. Mashallah, Daddy Redguard is streaming. I love you. Macron equals Thatcher. Le Pen equals Mussolini. I have a quick question. I'm an art major that's going to be graduating this year. What can I do to help bring the revolution as an artist? Well, for one, you're already fucking up by thinking that you as an individual bring the revolution. You have to be, it has to be a collective effort. Like you have to join a collective. You have to join an organization. You have to join DSA. So what can you do to help bring the revolution? You are a painter, you are a drawer, and you are a printmaker. Well, revolution, especially in the United States, is going to be heavily based around aesthetics. Like, a lot of people join orgs simply because the aesthetic is nice. So join DSA and help your chapter produce some dope t-shirts, screen print some shit, make some posters. Like, there's work for you to do. We need artists. What is my take on trade unionists and the lack of revolutionary consciousness? Well, Lenin warned against the trade union mindset. Revolutionary intellectuals are important that ideally come from the working class, your Gramsci's organic intellectuals. We don't need, like, a lot of people interpret that saying to be like, oh, we just parachute in and we teach the stupid masses how to be communists. That's not how that works. Ideally, our intellectuals come from the working class and they still study communism, but they also work every day and they impart these ideas into their counterparts. So my take on trade unionists is that in the imperial core, trade unions are they're basically no better than a chamber of commerce. You should still join them, you should still work within them, but you cannot see these as revolutionary vessels yet. You have to turn them into revolutionary vessels. I am not against organizing and reactionary trade unions, okay? Like in the United States, especially the building trades, the carpenters unions. Like I have a friend that was literally run out of the carpenters union because they called him a commie. They called him a commie in the F word, as a matter of fact, but yeah. So you just have to keep in mind the nature of these beasts. Like an organization in which the secretary treasurer makes $750,000 a year, of course it's going to be corrupt. Of course it's going to be shitty. Okay? But you still have to work within them because they are still vessels for organizing the working class. Like, in no way am I saying that we should have the third world's position of writing off all unions in the United States or Canada or any other country in the West. Like, you still have to work within trade unions. You should join a union if it's possible. But also, it's our task to revolutionize them and win over the rank and file. It's not our task to just become so-called union organizers and eat up everybody's dues. You've beautifully said a lot already. I asked, what is the most significant difference, if possible to point to one, in the difference between MLM and MLM theory, dialectics of material organizing? Well, as I said at the beginning of the stream, the most important difference per the Communist Party of India Maoist would be the recognition of the fact that you have to continue revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat to consolidate socialism. You also have to combat modern revisionism, okay? So the struggle for communism against the impulse to revert to capitalism is probably our major thing. That's the most important difference between MLM and MLM theory, because a lot of MLs have the notion that once you have declared socialism, then you're all good. And that's where situations like the failed regimes in Africa, Laos, Vietnam, China, Cuba, like all of these are varying degrees of capitalist countries. Okay? Meaning that they're more closer to capitalism than socialism. So we have to break that spectrum, and we have to ensure that what we have is on the road to communism. That's why during the Cultural Revolution, you had rightists being called capitalist roaders, because Mao saw the transition stage as like basically you're driving your car down a road. And there's a fork in the road. So you can either take the socialist road, the communist road, or you can take the capitalist road. A lot of people took the capitalist road, and that has resulted in China being in the horrible situation it is in now. So yeah, probably the major, most significant difference is the recognition of class struggle under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Jay Mufawad Paul, good guy, internet buddy of mine. Did Joe and Jesus Christ, you motherfuckers can't spell. I've seen a lot of horrible spellings. How do you? Did Zhou Enlai write anything good? Zhou Enlai was more of an administrator. He was a centrist trending rightist. But I'm pretty sure I did read a pretty good text from him one time. I'm still tripping off that spelling. Thoughts on Continuity and Rupture. Really, really good book. You should read it. From Victory to Defeat is a very good book. What's good reads on documents of the PCP? It's hard to find good sources. There's literally collections of documents of the PCP. Hold on. Let me find them. Yeah, you all are a bunch of nerds. You all are just here asking me. You all are just here asking me for fucking books. So you have the fundamental documents of the PCP. Basically like their statements of line, etc. So if you want to learn about the PCP and what they thought and how they acted and why they acted as they did, I highly recommend reading their fundamental documents. Why? Because they're fundamental. I consider myself a hardcore Maoist, and I joined DSA before I joined a sect like PSL or Frizzo any day of the week. I have friends in both PSL and Frizzo. I would never join them, but I mean, there's good people in every org. When is the People's War going to happen? When you make it happen? What do you make of the upsurge in popularity for the Communist Party of Kenya in Kenya? Well, the Communist parties do well when, one, they are tied to the masses. The Communist Party of Kenya is. And two, when there's a crisis. There's a crisis in Kenya right now. So, of course, the communists who are linked with the masses are going to do well. So, all power to the CPK. How can you be a Maoist in a country that's pre-revolutionary? Seems larpy. Your mom is a larpy. How do you think that Deng's rise to power could have been avoided? If the Deng reforms never happened and China continued down the Mao path, how do you think it would look like in the 21st century? Deng's rise to power could have been avoided. Well, I don't think we should personalize stuff like this, because, like, if it had been Deng, it would have been somebody else. Okay, it would have been fucking whoever Chou En-lai picked. So Chou En-lai, my position is that he was a centrist. He sheltered a lot of these people. Like Deng Xiaoping was already knocked down, but the situation in the early 70s was such that the USSR and China were like literally on the verge of going to war. So Deng Xiaoping was a lot of things, but he was a hell of a good organizer of people. He's a hell of a good administrator. So Chou En-lai brought him back, along with his clique, along with a lot of other writers, including Xi Jinping's dad. Like Xi Jinping literally had to live in a cave because his dad was knocked down as a rightist. So Chou En-lai, with Mao's support, brought all these people back. And I think that was probably the biggest mistake that Mao made. Brought all these people back. And Deng and his clique, being the excellent political plotters that they are, maneuvered themselves into power. I already talked about the earthquake situation. They maneuvered themselves into power, and they won the support of a lot of the masses. So if we were in an alternate, bizarre world where China continued down the path of Maoism, they would be further down the road of communism. They would still be engaging in proletarian internationalist acts of solidarity. They wouldn't be exploiting Africa. They wouldn't be exploiting Vietnam. They wouldn't be exploiting Laos. They would actually be helping these countries develop themselves, because that's what communists do for each other. That's what the early Soviet Union did, and that's what China did during the Mao period. So there definitely would have been a lot of support for revolutions abroad. For example, China used to support the Communist Party of the Philippines, but after the turn in foreign policy and the warming up to Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, they cut off all aid for the NPA. A lot of comrades are still sore about that. They cut off aid for the NPA, for the NPA and the Communist Party of the Philippines, and they embraced the government. They also endorsed Pinochet's regime. So if China had switched away from those errors, and they were errors, they were big errors, and if it had returned to the path of proletarian internationalism, the world situation would be remarkably different, I think. How much leverage would having a nuke give the Palestinian resistance? I mean, North Korea has nukes and nobody has invaded them yet. Thoughts on Marcus Garvey? I have a love-hate relationship with him, because yes, he actually said that Mussolini stole the idea of fascism from him. Yeah. So he was kind of weird. And of course, everybody knows that he sat down and broke bread with the KKK and a bunch of other stupid things. He was also a rabid anti-communist, but a lot of people don't know why Marcus Garvey was an anti-communist. Garvey was anti-communist, even though he looked up to the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. He was an anti-communist because he thought that the white working class was irredeemably racist, and he didn't want those people in power. Like, ultimately, Marcus Garvey was a snob. I mean, he did grow up in a British colony, after all. He was a snob, and he thought that the better class of white people, the employing class, was worth more working with than with white trash that would probably end up lynching every black person they could get their hands on if they were ever in a position of political power. I mean, events to time. I mean, this guy was alive during the Tulsa riot. This guy was alive during the Red Summer of 1919. This guy was alive during the East St. Louis pogrom of 1917. So I don't blame him for believing that. Like, yeah, horrible shit was happening, courtesy of the white working class, stirred up by reactionary white labor leaders like Sam Gompers. So, yeah, in a way, I don't blame him for not seeing the benefits of allying with the white proletariat. I have heard of the All-African Revolutionary Party. I have heard of the All-African Revolutionary Party. Well, All-African People's Revolutionary Party, AAPRP. I keep calling it the AARP. But yeah, good folks. Hello, comrades. Solidarity. What are your thoughts on the Labour Party of the UK? It's a bourgeois sellout party. That's what I think of it. How am I able to tell if your chapter has bad actors? Well, how are we defining bad actors? Like people who are constantly stirring up shit, people who are constantly having breakdowns, people who are constantly talking shit on other people? Yeah. Those are bad actors. But some people have varying types of mental illness. Some people are just assholes. So how can you tell if your chapter is full of feds? Honestly, there's really no way to do that. Like having informer scares generally doesn't bode well for the future of any communist organization. But I would just advise you to use your fucking common sense. Thoughts on Juche? It's the ideology of self-reliance as developed by North Korea. The Black Panther Party actually had a Juche stage in like 70, 71 before the split between Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton. Honestly, it's become remarkably metaphysical, weird, and if I recall correctly, they removed all references to Marxism-Leninism from their foundational documents a few years ago. So, I mean, in a way, I understand why North Korea, why the DPRK, I'm sorry, Jucheists are like they are, because, again, this country has been surrounded, strangled with sanctions, and bombed into smithereens. Okay, like that kind of leads to some pretty loopy siege mentality shit. But do I think that Juche is a useful ideology for somebody in the UK or in the US to be having? No. What are my thoughts on Canadian communist orgs? I don't know much about Canadian communist orgs. I did support the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Maoist Party, before they fell apart. What are my opinions and analysis on the betrayal of the peoples who are in Nepal? I mean, that's what happens when you stop halfway. Like they did overthrow the monarchy. Okay, like the Maoists in Nepal technically did win, but you had Prachanda, who was a sellout. Like he was a sellout all the way back in 2001 when he was talking about how he wanted to make Nepal the Switzerland of the Himalayas. So, yeah, that's what happens when you don't conduct thorough political education in your party and you don't make room for line struggle. You allow one dude to derail the revolution in his own personal search for power. That's what happens. That's what happened in Nepal. Do I like jazz? I love jazz. Archie Shepp is probably my favorite artist. And will settler communists not be able to join a vanguard? Should we take a subordinate role as settlers? What is this? Do you just sit and flagellate yourself all fucking day? Like, what is? You're a communist, are you not? Communists should be judged based on their ability. No, a party that's full of settlers is probably not going to make revolution in the United States or Canada. But if you contribute to the revolution, you should be allowed to hold a position in the party. Like, what's this white people self-flagellating shit? Like, I get it. You're white. You feel so super bad. Do something about it. Like, John Brown didn't just sit around flagellating himself all fucking day. John Brown actually got up and did something about it. You should take a page from his book. Is supporting reparations for slavery a good thing? Also, thoughts on Cornel West. I actually saw Cornel West being fucked with by crackhead Barney the other day. I don't think Cornel West is ever going to be president. I also think that he's tippy-toe. He's like a fence rider on the Israel-Palestine question and a variety of other questions. He's also leaned heavily into some anti-vaxxer shit. Probably trying to pick up the stray idiot leftists who supported RFK Jr. now that RFK Jr. is supporting Trump. But I really like his sense of humor. Like he's a good sport. Like any other person would have been like, what the fuck, crackhead Barney, get away from me. But like crackhead Barney was like, yeah, you know, you ain't paying no child support for your kids. Cornell West was like, man, what them little people lying on me? Like, I like people like that. Like, that's blackness. Okay. Like when you're getting roasted, you roast right back. Is supporting reparations for slavery a good thing? Do you see what color my skin is? Why would I oppose slavery reparations? You all are asking stupid questions. Is Settlers generally a genuinely good read, or is all its praise online just irony? No, it's actually a pretty good book. You should read it. Thoughts on Tupac Amaru Shakur? Again, do you see what color my skin is? Like, y'all just asking dumb questions. What do you think I think of Tupac? What do you think I think of Tupac? I'm a black communist, for fuck's sake. Lessons learned from the Peruvian Communist Party. Well, one, Jefe Tura is fucking stupid. Two, just killing people because they want to go vote is stupid. Three, like, you actually have to have a contingency plan when shit like that happens. Think Gonzalo got captured because he got too comfortable. He got too comfortable, and like these people were in for him, they were out for him. So he got too comfortable. They caught the dude watching a boxing match with vodka, with a big ass bottle of Stolichnaya vodka next to him. They actually found out where he was because they went through his garbage. Like, he was living with this ballerina who was a party supporter in a like pretty nice house in a pretty nice part of Lima, because he couldn't live at high altitudes for too long because it flared up his psoriasis. Anyways, they went through this guy's garbage and they were like, I thought it was just two people that lived here, but like it's like they got a whole fucking army of people living here. So they went through his garbage and found psoriasis medication, Winston Light cigarettes, and Stolichnaya vodka. So eventually they kicked in his door and they found him sitting up watching the boxing match. What the boxing match was, I don't know. But yeah, that's how it got caught. So don't get caught with your pants down. What do I think of the PKK? I think they're based. National Liberation for Kurdistan. Who do I think will win the 2026 World Cup? I don't know. I don't care. Did you see the stupid Haas? I don't care about this guy. He's an idiot. If you follow Haas, if you seriously take anything that these people say seriously, then there's no hope for you. After all the shit, after all the contradictory shit that they've done, if you still take these people seriously, and he's on Fresh and Fit, who the fuck listens to Fresh and Fit anymore? Like, but who cares? Okay. Yes, we know these people are liars. We know they're full of shit. Okay, stop talking about them. They have no bearing or impact on what we must do in the United States. Favorite video game of all time is probably a tie between Skyrim and Tropico and GTA. My little niece said Asada is pretty. Aw. What are my issues with the PSL? Why wouldn't I join it? Because they have a shitload of scandals surrounding them. Plus, they're revisionists with a trot heritage. It's just not my cup of tea. And I hear about the Texas Attorney General swatting a woman who was signing up Hispanic people to vote. Yes, I did. That's not all that surprising. Biggie or Tupac? I'm probably going to go with Tupac because Tupac never rapped about tying up someone's daughter with electrical tape. Thoughts on Edward Snow's books? Really good. Red Star Over China was actually the first interview that had been done with members of the CCP. Like, it basically introduced the CCP to the world. Have I heard of the Turkish Maoist Tico? Were those the ones that were doing suicide bombings? That name sounds familiar. I remember they did something like that. Advice to new Maoists. Focus on work. Like, study, but focus on work. A lot of y'all just focus on reading and arguing with people on the internet. Like, get out of these little stupid-ass Discord groups where you infect each other with stupidity and gaseous doom and think you're so much smarter than everybody else. Get out amongst the masses. Get out amongst the masses and actually, do shit. Do some work. Join DSA. If there's one thing that DSA will give you, it will give you work. Okay? That is what you need to do. That's what's important. Like, you need to inoculate yourself from being terminally online by hanging out with regular people and by doing work for and amongst regular people. You cannot do the mass line if you're Like a lot of people think that just going out handing out stupid pamphlets to people is the mass line. That's not the mass line. That's the ass line. The mass line is when you go out and you actually listen to what people have to say. You channel this through our knowledge of Marxist, Leninist, Maoist ideology. And then you take these things back to the people for them to accept or reject based on what they need at the time. That's the mass line. The mass line, the application, the proper application of the mass line requires humility. Because if something is not working, people are going to tell you, you know what, man, this shit ain't working. Get the fuck out of my neighborhood. You have to be humble. You cannot be arrogant. You cannot just write off people as hopeless reactionaries because they don't agree with you. So until you break that, and a lot of Maoists have this tendency, until you break that tendency in yourself, you ain't no Maoist. Maoists do work. Maoists are humble. Maoists take that serve the people shit seriously. If you don't take that serve the people shit seriously and your goal is just to establish a stupid meme regime, quit calling yourself a Maoist. People already think we're crazy enough as it is because of the fucking Red Guards. Would I agree that we sadly need anti-clericalism in 2021? It's a stupid fucking question. Most of the people in this country, most of the people in the world are religious. See how far you'll get by hating on people's religion. No, we do not need anti-clericalism in 2024. You're tired of people making excuses for religion. Well, tough fucking titties. People are religious. Even under socialism, people are going to be religious. You're not going to take people's religion away unless you want a massive uprising that your stupid ass brought on yourself. Is Wales imperialist? I believe that Welsh people were part of the British colonization of the entire world, but at the beginning, Wales was actually a victim of the of English imperialism. Chinese communists thought Edgar Snow was a spy pretty much the whole time. I mean, I would too. White dude just shows up in your guerrilla zone and starts asking you a bunch of questions. I would think he's a spy too. What kind of work will DSA assign you? We're not that type of party. Get in where you fit in. Do I believe that Maoists can and should build solidarity with other Marxist tendencies under current conditions in America? Yeah. Like, we can't make revolution by ourselves. Like, how many Maoists are there in the United States? Like, real Maoists? 500 out of a population of 344 million? Yeah, we're going to have to make friends. Could ideology like Maui or Trotsky, Lenin be as useful as anything but a baseline? Have they evolved since creation? Of course, for dialectical materialists, we realize that every fucking thing evolves. Every fucking thing evolves. If you're not evolving, you're dying. You guys want to see something funny? You're a boy, make a big noise, playing in the street, gonna be a big man someday. If you vote for any of those people, that is what you're voting for. Adios.